بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين المعصومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. قال تعالى في كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: إن الذين توفاهم الملائكة ظالمي أنفسهم قالوا فيم كنتم قالوا كنا مستضعفين في الأرض قالوا ألم تكن أرض الله واسعة فتهاجروا فيها فأولئك مأواهم جهنم وساءت مصيرا. صدق الله العلي العظيم. وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد. In the years that followed the tragedy of Ashura, members of the Muslim community, chief amongst them the lovers of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, began to ask important philosophical questions, critical questions, such as how could an atrocity so great in magnitude be carried out on earth? How could the family of the most beloved of creation be subject to such humiliation? How could this happen on earth? Where was God in Karbala? And in an attempt to answer these critical questions, among the scholars who attempted to answer these questions was al-Shaykh al-Saduq in his book Al-I'tiqadat fi Din al-Imamiyya. And in a thorough discussion, al-Shaykh al-Saduq differentiated theologically and philosophically between the will of God and the desire of God. Everything in this universe happens, takes place through the will of God. There is nothing which has power independently of God. However, this does not mean that everything that takes place on earth God desires and loves to see happen. Quite the contrary. Even the first man that was created and sent to earth, the Prophet Adam alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had commanded him to refrain from eating from that tree. But he ate from that tree. Human beings quite often do things that go against what God desires, what God likes, even though whatever we do is inseparable from His will. For instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ التَّوَّابِينَ وَيُحِبُّ الْمُتَطَهِّرِينَ. What God loves is different than His mashi'ah, what He wills. He says in the Quran that He loves those who are repenting, who repent, and those who purify themselves. Does this mean that everybody who commits an act of disobedience repents? Certainly not. Does this mean that everybody purifies themselves? Certainly not. And so by explaining it in this way, Shaykh al-Saduq said that yes, as horrendous as it was, as atrocious as it was not separable from the will of God, but God did not desire for this to happen. It was the responsibility and the fault of those who stood against Imam Hussein alayhi salam, meaning that they had the free will, the choice, and yesterday we spoke about the freedom to do what they did. And as we are not robots, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to a certain extent to act out of our free will. It's the whole point of this existence, the existence of this dunya. So that we distinguish between those who choose righteousness and those who choose evil. And these critical questions, these existential philosophical questions, allow us to delve deeper into the subject of evil and chaos, and where does evil stem from? Why is it that people become confused within the chaos, and that confusion leads them down the road of evil and atrocities? During the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one can suggest that the line between iman, belief, and kufr, misbelief, was clear. قُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلِ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. Those who believed, that stood by the Prophet, peace be upon him, it was clear who truly stood by him versus those who stood against him. Except in the case of a handful of people, the munafiqeen. Some of them who are clearly mentioned in the Quran, in Surah Al-Munafiqun. Some of them, their identities were hidden, God says, even to the Prophet himself. In one verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that amongst you and around you in the city of Medina, there are people who insist on their nifaq, their hypocrisy. You do not know them. You cannot identify them. However, we have identified them. This was a small group of people. But as time began to pass, that line, that distinction between iman and kufr, between belief and misbelief, those lines started to become a little bit more blurry, and chaos began to ensue. For instance, during the time of Al-Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, only 30 years after the martyrdom of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, we're told of two examples where Amir al-Mu'mineen made clear to his followers the distinction between truth and falsehood. And he made an emphasis, he conveyed an emphasis to his followers so that they do not become confused by slogans and by sayings. In today's world, you hear a slogan, you chant a slogan, and if it's well designed, that slogan, if it's well engineered, you can easily influence the masses to chant the slogan after you, correct? And there are many slogans that exist in today's world. Amir al-Mu'mineen, during the Battle of Jamal, the first civil war that took place in Islam, and some of you are familiar with the story when one of his companions came up to him and he said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, you know, what's going on? We're here for battle, and I look to the other side of the battlefield and I find Fulan and Fulan and Fulan, and these were people that, you know, we were all part of one community. We were a harmonious community. What happened? They were confused. Amir al-Mu'mineen looked to the companion. He said to him, Innaka lamalbusun alayk. Literally, you seem confused. You look a little bit confused. Let me clarify a principle for you that will remove your confusion. He told him that truth and falsehood are not determined. They are not defined by the actions of man. اعرف الحق تعرف أهله واعرف الباطل تعرف أهله. If you recognize truth for what it is, as an independent concept, as an independent idea, a reality, not defined by the actions of one man or another man, then you will identify those who are truthful. وَعْرِفِ الْبَاطِلَ تَعْرِفْ أَهْلَهِ. If you understand falsehood or evil as an independent reality, independent of man's actions, you will be able to identify those who are on that path, the path of evil and falsehood. اعرف الحق تعرف أهله واعرف الباطل تعرف أهله. And in today's world, when we don't understand this concept, this is why we find cult followings. People have a cultish, slavish attachment to one individual because they get so caught up in whatever this person says is the truth that the truth becomes defined by the person's actions, not the opposite way around. And this is why you find cult followings. And the opposite is also true. اعرف الحق تعرف أهله واعرف الباطل تعرف أهله. Another example which also took place during the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen was during the battle of Siffin, the next battle that took place, the second civil war. When a group of the followers of Muawiyah raised the Qur'ans on the spears, some of the followers of Amir al-Mu'mineen decided to end that battle. They did not want to fight. They did not want to move forward. And to make a long story short, there was a group from the followers of Amir al-Mu'mineen that rebelled, who later on became the Khawarij. And their slogan was what? La hukma illa lillah. They said that there is no authority, no rule, no power except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What they were trying to say, that Ya Ali, you have no more authority, you have no more power. Even though it was not his idea to cease fire. Some of the followers of Amir al-Mu'mineen, they became intimidated by this. They became fooled by this. They became confused by this statement because the statement in itself is true, correct? La hukma illa lillah. We believe that there is no true authority except to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what they were implying was falsehood. There was a sinister implication behind that. And that's why Amir al-Mu'mineen, he delivered a powerful statement. And this statement rings true today. Whenever you come across a slogan, evaluate it in this way. Amir al-Mu'mineen said, كَلِمَةُ حَقٍّ يُرَادُ بِهَا بَاطِل. Such a powerful statement. That it is true that there is no authority except the authority of God. But what they are implying is falsehood. كَلِمَةُ حَقٍّ يُرَادُ بِهَا بَاطِل. Today we see slogans that it sounds good to chant it, but what is implied by what is being said, not what is being said. كَلِمَةُ حَقٍّ يُرَادُ بِهَا بَاطِل. These were statements designed to clear up the confusion, to provide clarity in times of confusion. Al-Imam Sayyid al-Shuhada Abi Abdullah al-Husayn alayhi salam also had a similar statement when assessing the situation around him. When he detected the ironies that took place at that time, that led to that disaster, that led to that catastrophe. He said, إِنَّ النَّاسَ عَبِيدُ الدُّنْيَا وَالدِّينُ لَعِقٌ عَلَىٰ أَلْسِنَتِهِمْ. That people may say one thing, they may believe in one thing, but the reality is that they are slaves of this dunya, and their faith, it's like the saliva that resides in their mouth. It's just there in their mouth. It's just repeated. And then he says later on in that statement, فَإِذَا مُحِّصُوا بِالْبَلَاءِ قَلَّ الدَّيَانُ. That when they're truly put to the test, when they're put under pressure, people abandon their faith because their faith has become something that has no value. It's just something which is repeated like a slogan. So during times of confusion, during times of chaos, we need clarity. And the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, they laid out the principles before us for us to be able to examine when we come across slogans, when we come across ideas, when we come across movements. What is the truth behind it? Is it truly a statement of truth, or is it a statement of truth which falsehood is implied because of it or through it? كَلِمَةُ حَقٍّ يُرَادُ بِهَا بَاطِل. When it comes to the perpetuation of evil, a question that exists is that what are the causes of evil? And what types of evil exist in the world. There was one author who said that there are 3 types of evil which exist in the world. Is evil something which is inherent in people? Is it you're born a good person or you're born a bad person? Or does it have to do with the environment that you're raised in? Does it have to do with the society that you were born in? Or is it another cause entirely? And what he suggested was the following. He said that there are 3 types of evil that exist in the world. Number 1, there is dispositional evil. This is the theory of the bad apples. You know, they say that one bad apple or one spoiled apple ruins the whole barrel, correct? There are certain bad apples. Every once in a while in a barrel, you'll find one spoiled apple. A lone wolf type of situation. And that most people are inherently good. You find a guy like Anders Breivik, who a number of years ago went on a shooting spree in Norway because he believed that Norway was becoming a Muslim country and he had to do something about it. So he killed dozens of his own countrymen. That's a bad apple. Why? Because Norway is a relatively peaceful country. It's a relatively peaceful society. That's a bad apple. That's one type of evil that exists. It's dispositional evil. The second is situational. It's about the barrel. Meaning that do not look at the personality. Look at the situation. What factors contributed to this person behaving in this way? Was it the family that they were raised in? Was it the faith that they believed in? This is a second type. And the third is systemic. And this is the type that is ignored the most. Meaning that it's not the individual, the apple. It's not the situation. It's not where they were raised. It's not the barrel. It's systemic. It's the barrel maker. It is the governments. It is the corporations. It is the big groups that create the system where oppression and injustice and evil thrive. And this is the type which is mainly ignored. You know, we read in the ziyarat, for instance, we read in the ziyarah of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, ziyarat Ashura, that among those who curse are whom? وَلَعَنَ اللَّهُ مَنْ أَسَّسَ أَسَاسَ الظُّلْمِ وَالْجَوْرِ عَلَيْكُمْ. There are certain personalities which are mentioned in the ziyarat, correct? They are mentioned by name. If you take ziyarat Ashura, it explicitly mentions certain names. But we also have a tendency to get caught up in the name. When it comes to criticizing and praising, we get caught up in certain personalities. And yes, we must mention those personalities. We must mention the wrong that they did, and we must criticize them for that. But don't get attached to personalities without understanding that there is a system, there is a foundation that allows those injustices and acts of oppression to thrive. This is why we say, وَلَعَنَ اللَّهُ مَنْ أَسَّسَ أَسَاسَ الظُّلْمِ وَالْجَوْرِ عَلَيْكُمْ أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ. That those who created the foundations of oppression and injustice against you, those are the ones that we should look to. We should look to the situation. We should look to the system that created, that tolerated, that endorsed, that allowed for these acts of oppression and injustice to take place in the first place. A number of years ago, there was a couple of experiments conducted by 2 social scientists who happened to be schoolmates of one another, Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo. Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo were 2 social scientists that grew up in the 1960s in the United States. They both lived in the Bronx, in New York City. For those of you who are familiar, the Bronx is one of the more rougher, less advantaged boroughs in New York. Philip Zimbardo ended up teaching as a professor of social science at Stanford University in California, while his colleague Stanley Milgram stayed on the East Coast, and he taught at Yale University. And both of them, because they had grown up in areas where they had seen how society can bring the worst out of an individual, they became curious as social scientists as to how does evil actually take place, and why is it that good people do bad things? Have you ever wondered, sometimes you see a good person do a bad thing and you think, how is it that a good person does a bad thing? Is there an evil gene that exists within us that's dispositional, that one day decides to rear its ugly head, and that forces you down the road of oppression and injustice? Is it the environment that you're born in, or is it the system? What is it that causes good people to do bad things, seemingly good people? Stanley Milgram conducted his own experiment at Yale University in the 1960s, and Stanley Milgram had lived through World War II, and he had witnessed the trials that took place after World War II, where those who had committed the greatest and most heinous of atrocities were put to trial. And some of them, their excuse was, we were put in this position, we were compelled, we were forced. This was an act of jabr, it was an act of compulsion, and they pleaded their innocence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, there are two verses which describe people who are placed under authority, under an authority which compels them to do evil. Is it excusable or is it not excusable? Two verses in the Quran. The first, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ تَوَفَّاهُمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ ظَالِمِي أَنفُسِهِمْ إِنَّ الَّذِينَ تَوَفَّاهُمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ ظَالِمِي أَنفُسِهِمْ قَالُوا فِيمَ كُنْتُمْ. On the day of judgment, there will be oppressors, people who commit acts of injustice. They will be summoned and they will be asked, Fima kuntum. What was your deal? What's your story? Why did you do what you did? قالوا كنا مستضعفين في الأرض. They will say that we were weak, we were weakened in the land. Meaning that, we weren't in a position of power. We were just following the orders of those who were above us. The angels will respond to them. قالوا ألم تكن أرض الله واسعة فتهاجروا فيها فأولئك مأواهم جهنم وساءت مصيرا. That if you were in a place, if you were in a country, in a city, if you were part of an organization, a company, which perpetuated these acts of evil and injustice, was not God's earth vast enough for you to move? If you don't like where you are, you're not a tree. A tree can't decide one day, I don't like being in this park. I want to be in the park across the street because there's other trees and I want to mingle with those trees, and this park is bad for my mental health. A tree can't do that. It can't uproot itself and move from one place to another. As a human being, you can certainly uproot yourself and move from one place to another. أَلَمْ تَكُنْ أَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةٌ فَتُهَاجِرُوا فِيهَا فَأُولَٰئِكَ مَأْوَاهُمْ جَهَنَّمْ وَسَاءَتْ مَصِيرًا. Of course, this is contextual, but this is a general meaning. Another verse in Surah Saba says that there will be two groups of oppressors that will be resurrected with one another. The influencers and those who were influenced. قَالَ الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا لِلَّذِينَ اسْتَكْبَرُوا. These are the two groups. الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا, those who were weakened, those who were influenced, those who were evildoers that were taken advantage of. And on the other hand, you have الَّذِينَ اسْتَكْبَرُوا, the ones who were in the position of authority. They were the ones that influenced them to carry out these acts. قال الذين استضعفوا للذين استكبروا بل مكر الليل والنهار إذ تأمروننا أن نكفر بالله ونجعل له أندادا. They will say to them on the day of judgment, in front of the angels, they will point to those who influenced them. They will say, it was you, through your scheming and through your deceit, مكر الليل والنهار إذ تأمروننا. You were the ones that commanded us to misbelieve in Allah and to associate with Him partners. وَأَسَرُّوا النَّدَامَةَ لَمَّا رَأَوُا الْعَذَابِ. And this regret is generated when they witness the punishment in front of them. Because that's when the excuses really pop up, right? So when you see the consequences. If there's no consequence, then you just carry on living your life doing whatever you do. Is it the system? Is it the person? Is it the environment? So Stanley Milgram, going back to his story, wanted to figure it out. He said, you know, these people who are claiming that it's not my fault, as a social scientist, I want to figure out, why were they doing evil? So he went about creating an experiment, today known as the Milgram experiment. And the Milgram experiment, in a nutshell, had people who signed up to be teachers. And the experiment was conducted in the following way. There were two rooms connected to one another. In one room, you had a person who had signed up, who didn't know that this was actually an experiment meant to prove a point. They thought they were actually there to teach a lesson, and they were told that this experiment was designed to test people's memory. In fact, it had nothing to do with memory at all. They would sit behind a computer, and they could do two things. They could administer a test through the computer to someone who was sitting on the other side in the other room. They were told the following, that the person sitting in the other room is strapped to a chair, and they had a device hooked to them that they could receive electrical shocks through. Something, very, very benign, nothing too dangerous. And that when you ask them a question through the computer from your room, if they get it right, you move on to the next question. If they get it wrong, you have a button and a dial which administers a very mild electric shock. It starts at 15 volts. Something that, they would not really feel. It doesn't really cause any damage or anything like that. And the person who was administering the test, asking the questions, would have someone standing behind them, and to make it seem very official, this person would be wearing a lab coat. If you're wearing a lab coat, you take it very seriously. And they would encourage them to keep going, keep administering the shock when the learner got the answer wrong. Now, the shocks started at 15 volts. And they increased by increments of 15 volts. So the second shock would be 30 volts. Okay, a little bit more irritation. The third, 45 volts. The fourth, 60 volts. Until it gets to about 300 volts. And when they would press the button, they believed that there was an electric shock being administered, but in reality, there was no electric shock. All that would be played was a sound of someone screaming from the other room. And it went up all the way to 400 volts. Now, 400 volts is deadly. And it clearly said under 400 volts, X, 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 which means what? What does it mean? Death. You're going to kill the guy. So Stanley Milgram set up this experiment. He set up the rooms. They got a bunch of people who had signed a contract to be part of this memory testing memory experience, testing memory experiment. But before he conducted it, he went to all of the psychiatrists that he knew, 40 of them. He said, what percentage do you feel would administer the full extent of the shock? They said, you have to be crazy to administer the full extent of the shock. He said, okay, just give me a percentage. Most of them said 1%. Out of everyone that you get, only 1% is going to administer the full shock. Because in their mind, they're thinking you really have to be like a sociopath or a psychopath to administer the full extent of the shock, even if you're being compelled. They believed that a human being has the willpower to say no to authority when they are being forced to do evil. This is our belief in the inherent goodness of people, that we have the willpower to resist authority when authority tells us to do evil. How many percent would administer the full extent of the shock? It wasn't 1%. It wasn't 10%. It wasn't 20%. 65% of people administered the full shock. Now, the first time that they would administer the shock and they would hear a sound from the other room, they would hesitate. The person standing behind them in the lab coat would say, "You have to continue." They would administer it a second time. They would get more nervous. They would start to hear outcries. They would start to hear, of course, a recorded voice. Nobody was really in the other room. They would hear the person crying out for help, saying, "I have a heart condition. I'm going to die." The rule was, if the person administering the test resisted 3 times, then you would let them go. But not the first time and not the second time. It would have to be 3 times. You would have to remind them that you're under contract and the person in the other room is under contract as well, and you have to continue. 65%. And that began to change the minds of those social scientists at the time, that even though people are inherently good, even though they don't want to hurt others, but when you force them to, people crack under pressure because of authority. And this tells us about the power of authority. This is why the Quran warns us as to who we place as an authority above us. Correct? That word, the word awliya, ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, la tattakhidu, it says, do not take the disbelievers as awliya above you. Do not place the disbelievers in a position of authority, because as good of a heart as you may have, you don't want to hurt anyone, you don't want to do evil. The human being is prone to evil through authority, by way of authority. So when Stanley Milgram concluded this experiment, his colleague, Philip Zimbardo, who was at Stanford University, decided, I'm going to do my own experiment. And this became known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. And there's a whole documentary about it. There's a book about it. I recommend you watch it. Very, very interesting. And basically what they did was they took one of the rooms, and they do these at Ivy League schools. You know, you're paying $60,000 for a little experiment. They took them into one of the basements of one of the halls in Stanford University, and they set up a mock prison. Now, everybody who was involved in this experiment knew that it was pretend. There wasn't anyone who was like confused, who was told something else. They were told that you will participate in a mock prison experiment. And they wanted to see how quickly and how easily the guards that they set up would administer torture to the prisoners that they set up. And so what did they do? They built a mock prison. Nothing serious. I mean, if you really wanted to break through the walls, you could break through the walls. It was a mock prison. They found the healthiest, physically, mentally healthiest men that they can find. They called the Palo Alto Police Department to help them with the arrests. They weren't really arrests, but they pretended that it was real. And they took 24 people. Philip, the professor himself, Philip Zimbardo, he acted as the warden of the prison. And he appointed a superintendent. And randomly, by the flip of a coin, 12 of them were assigned as prisoners, and 12 of them were assigned as prison guards. And the warden and superintendent, they encouraged the prison guards to inflict torment and pain and torture on the prisoners. And it began with something very basic. You know, they would have them do push-ups and jumping jacks, and then they would deprive them of food and water, and then they would make them clean the toilet with their hands, and then they would give them a bucket to go to the toilet in. They would remove their blankets, and this all happened within a few days. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. Within 36 hours, 5 of the prisoners, again, people who knew that this was a mock experiment, had emotional breakdowns. One of them was put in a closet for a few hours, and he began to bang his head against the closet door until he passed out. And it all came to a screeching halt. It was a mock experiment. But what Philip Zimbardo said was the following, was that because we constructed the environment, we made the rules, we were the ones that endorsed, and even though it was pretend authority, the guards, they really started to believe in their own authority. They really started to think that they were actual prison guards who were given the permission to torment prisoners. He said they internalized the roles that they were given. So whatever group we find ourselves in, we start to internalize our roles. Again, this tells us of the importance of environment. That good people can end up doing bad things if they were put in a terrible situation. Now, fast forward many years later, Philip Zimbardo says we have an actual real-life example of this prison experiment, what happened in Abu Ghraib 20 years ago, the prison in Baghdad. For those of you who are, I can actually say this now, for those of you who are old enough to remember, it seems like yesterday, that a small group of American, they weren't even part of the American military actually, they were military police. The way that they were treating the Iraqi prisoners, the humiliating way. And people ask, how does this happen under the watch of a military? It's the system that was created there. It's the system that allowed for that oppression and that injustice to take place. That's why, from the point of view of the Quran and the point of view of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, it's not just about individuals. Some people get tied up of individuals. Well, if this person was so bad, why isn't their name mentioned in the Quran? Why this and that? Because it's not about the person. It's not about the apple. It's not about the barrel. It's about the barrel maker. And sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where we are actively creating systems of oppression and injustice. And what Philip Zimbardo said, he said that evil, and I love this statement, he said evil begins with 15 volts, not with 400 volts. Evil begins with 15 volts. It's that small act of racism. It's that small act of discrimination. It's that small act of dehumanization which we deem as insignificant, which can have an effect, which can compound and snowball and build momentum until you have entire systems of oppression and injustice. That's why when it comes to oppression and injustice and sin and disobedience in the Quran is referred to as dhulm al-nafs, oppression and injustice against the self. The Quran says in chapter number 24, Surah An-Nur, وَتَحْسَبُونَهُ هَيِّنًا وَهُوَ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ عَظِيمٌ. That you constantly minimize your misdeeds and your shortcomings, but in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are very great. Not because of the deed itself, but because of the potential of that deed to snowball into something greater. And this is why, as the followers of Ahlul Bayt, we are vigilant, and the Imams taught us to be vigilant when it comes to participating in acts of oppression and injustice. The Quran says, وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا فَتَمَسَّكُمُ النَّارِ. Do not even turn in the direction of the oppressors, lest the fire should reach you. One day, a man comes to Al-Imam Ja'far As-Sadiq alayhi salam, and he says to him, Ya ibn Rasulillah, I'm an architect, I'm a builder, I'm a contractor, and the government has contracted me to build roads, the government of Banu al-Abbas. They've contracted me to build roads and highways and bridges. Is this permissible for me to do? Think about it. You're building a road, you're building a bridge, you're building a highway, you're building something that's serving humanity. But because it was upon the command of the evildoers, the oppressors, the Imam responded, he said, we would hate for our followers, our Shia, to be involved or related to any act of oppression or injustice in any way, shape, or form. Get away from it. Get as far distant from it as possible. And that's why people ask questions sometimes, fiqhi questions, jurisprudential questions that, I'm working with this company and I'm not sure if it's right or wrong. There's a hadith by Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam which teaches us how to conduct ourselves and what to do. What is the course of action when you come to these difficult and confusing situations? It says, دَعْ مَا يُرِيبُكْ إِلَى مَا لَا يُرِيبُكْ. Leave the things which cause you doubt. Turn away from the things which cause you doubt towards that which does not cause you doubt. If you doubt it, ask the question. If you doubt it, then it's probably better to stay away. Not always, but it's probably better. If you're conscious and your gut is telling you that there's something wrong here, that this could actually lead to something bigger, and we know ourselves. بَلِ الْإِنسَانُ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ بَصِيرًا وَلَوْ أَلْقَى مَعَاذِيرًا. Man knows himself, and he knows himself very well, and he knows the consequences of his actions, even though he comes up with many excuses. Since the experiments such as the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment were conducted decades ago, social scientists have been interested in the topic of what are some of the causes of evil. And they've mentioned a number of factors. One factor is dehumanization. When we dehumanize people, we're more likely to commit acts of oppression and injustice against people when we dehumanize them, when we take away the things that make them human. If we see them as inferior, if we see them as less than, if we see them as not deserving enough because of their color of skin or their language or their background or where they come from. Dehumanization. And this happens sometimes. This happens even within and exists even within our cultures and our language sometimes. Dehumanization is one of the factors that contributes to the perpetuation of injustice and evil acts. This is one of them. Another is anonymity. When you remain anonymous. Today we have an abundance of keyboard warriors. Yes? Keyboard warriors. People who are anonymous online, on social media. And it's always the people who are most anonymous that have the biggest mouths, biggest nerve to swear and curse and dehumanize and say the nastiest things, the worst things that they would not say to you in your face. Keyboard warriors. Remaining anonymous. People love to perpetuate evil and remain anonymous, right? Because they don't want to be held accountable. They don't want to be held responsible for it. Another is obedience to authority, which the social science experiments proved. You may think that you have great willpower, which is true. As human beings, we are endowed with willpower, but when you come under the authority of someone who just has that much greater influence, that much a little bit of a stronger personality, that much charm or suave, people who know how to get things out of people. Or if you fall under the influence of, God forbid, a narcissist or a psychopath or a sociopath. And there are many of those. One study that I was reading, a research study, it said out of every 150 people, there's at least one sociopath in that crowd of 150 people. I think there's more than 150 people here. So if you're looking to your side, something which is rampant in society. Of course, not the followers of Ahlul Bayt. I'm speaking here about even amongst Muslims there are perverse hearts. And even amongst the followers of Ahlul Bayt, there are perverse hearts. When I say psychopath or socio, I don't mean this as an insult. I mean it as something, a spiritual disease which resides in the nafs, which, anyone from any background can come from. De-individuation is another factor of evil. When you lose yourself in a crowd. Have you noticed that you go to, say, a sporting event, and maybe you're not a fan of that team that's playing, but because everybody else is cheering for that team, you automatically lose your sense of self and you start to cheer for that team as well. This is de-individuation. So what happens when we find ourselves among a group of evildoers? And those that fought against Imam Hussein alayhi salam, by the way, some of them, they were not bloodthirsty by nature. They did not have a bloodlust. Some of them were. Some of them were bloodthirsty indeed, such as Shimr ibn Dhil Jawshan and Sinan ibn Anas and Khiwalla ibn Yazid, the ones who committed the most heinous crimes. Yes, these were people who were psychopaths. They had a bloodlust and they wanted to quench that thirst for blood that they had. Some of them were there because they were compelled. Some of them were there because of authority. Were they excused? They were not excused. But it's easy for us to fall under the influence of those above us. That's why you have to evaluate your relationships. You have to assess your relationships. A person of authority is not necessarily wearing a suit and a badge and a cap. That's not the case. It can be much more nuanced. It could be much more subtle than that. But we, as the followers of Ahlul Bayt, must be vigilant how we observe people. And we must assess our relationships and those who have authority above us. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So we know that evil has variables. What about the opposite? What about heroism? There's no research on heroism. And what makes a hero? In the same way that there is on, there's not the same level of experiments. But people can also be heroes. Heroes are ordinary people who do extraordinary things. Hero is not just the people that we read about in stories, Achilles and Hector and Agamemnon and in Greek mythology, we read about the stories of heroes. We read stories of heroes every day, ordinary people who do extraordinary things. In the United States, we have the example during the Civil Rights Movement of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a seamstress. She was a black lady who in the 1950s refused to sit in the back of the bus where the colored people were supposed to sit. She sat in the front where the white people were sitting. And she was tired. She said it when they interviewed her and when they took her mugshot, she had a smile on her face because she knew that she didn't do anything wrong. She said, I was just sick and tired of giving in to the evil that was all around me. An ordinary person, a seamstress, who decided to sit on the front of the bus. And this became an extraordinary act of heroism. Every single one of you, brothers and sisters, you may see yourselves as ordinary, but there will come a time in your life where you have the chance to do something extraordinary. Every single one of us will have those moments in our lives. Being a hero does not necessarily mean that you're wearing a cape. In fact, that's fantasy. I don't know if you have figured that out. There's no such thing as Batman and Superman. These are metaphors. The real heroes are the ordinary people that do extraordinary things. And we have so many examples throughout society, people who inspire us on a daily basis. And every single one of you, brothers and sisters, can be a hero. All it requires is you make a heroic choice in an uncomfortable time. Not wearing a cape, not having a logo, but doing the right thing at the right time. And we will all be tested. We know that the Ahlul Bayt were tested. We know that the companions of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam were tested. How many stories do we have of the companions who were ordinary people that did extraordinary things? Such as whom? Al-Hurr ibn Yazid al-Riyahi made a choice. Within a few moments he made a choice. He said, I saw heaven and hell in front of me, and I decided that nothing is more valuable to me than heaven. How would I choose hell over heaven? Every single one of us can be a hero. But we must first be able to identify the slogans around us, the systems around us, the deities around us that cause us to move towards injustice and oppression and avoid them at all costs. And it begins with yourself, working on your nafs. When we look at the atrocities that took place, that were perpetuated against the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, we look at the causes, we look at society, we look at what behaviors were condoned, what behaviors were allowed. And that first act of oppression began when they rebelled against Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. When they turned against him and his command to love and follow and honor his closest of kin, his beloved family, the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. His beloved daughter, Lady Fatima al-Zahra alayha salam, who he said multiple times, Fatima bad'atun minni, man adhaha faqad adhani. Fatima, she is a piece of me. Whoever hurts her has hurt me. Whoever offends her has offended me. Whoever has taken from her has taken from me. This was the first act of oppression, which culminated in a snowball effect, which then ended with what happened in Karbala. And of course, the acts of injustice and oppression continued after that. But the greatest of them all, according to the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam themselves, Al-Imam Al-Hasan Al-Mujtaba tells his brother Al-Husayn alayhi salam, La yawm ka yawmika ya Aba Abdullah. There is no day like your day. And in answering the question of how could something so heinous happen, the great poet Ibn al-Arandis al-Hilli says a few words of poetry describing Imam Hussein alayhi salam. That how could something like this happen to a man like Hussein ibn Ali alayhi salam. He says, Imamun abuhu al-murtada alamul huda, wasiyu rasulillah, was-sinwu was-sihru, إمام بكته الإنس والجن والسما ووحش الفلا والطير والبر والبحر له القبة البيضاء بالطف لم تزل تطوف بها طوعا ملائكة غر وفيه رسول الله قال وقوله صحيح صريح ليس في ذلكم نكر حبي بثلاث ما أحاط بمثلها ولي فمن زيد هناك ومن عمرو له تربة فيها الشفاء وقبة يجاب بها الداعي إذا مسه الضر وذرية درية منه 9 أئمة حق لا 8 ولا 10 أيقتل ظمآنا حسين بكربلاء وفي كل جزء من أنامله بحر ووالده الساقي على الحوض غدا وفاطمة ماء الفرات لها مهر. How was Hussein killed thirsty in Karbala when every molecule of his body is an ocean of water, and his father is the one that will quench the thirst of the believers in paradise, and his mother Fatima, the entire Euphrates River is her mahar. How is it that he is killed thirsty? Such beautiful, eloquent words by this poet. How is it that something like this can even take place? And in remembering those atrocities on the day of Ashura, we say that the spirit of Lady Fatima alayhi salam was present. She was fully there on the day of Ashura. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, during those final moments as he was about to head out into the battlefield after his family members and loved ones were killed, he rode his horse for that last time. He mounted And as he began to head out into the battlefield, he heard a faint voice behind him call out, Sayyidi Aba Abdullah, my dear Hussein, just wait a few moments. He turned around, he saw that it was his dear sister, Lady Zainab alayhi salam. She said, I have one final request for you. I need you to come down from this horse. He came down from the horse. He turned to her. He said, what is it, my dear sister? What is it, my dear lady? She said to him, Sayyidi Aba Abdullah, Hilli Azrar al-Dira. Oh, Aba Abdullah, I want you to open up the chest plate, open up the armor which is protecting your neck and your chest. When he did so, she came to him and she planted a kiss on his neck and his chest. Then she turned towards the city of Medina. She said, Ummah Fatima, لقد أديت الأمانة واسترجعت الوديعة. My dear mother Fatima, I have done exactly what you have told me to do. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un.